You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, voted best Star Trek podcast with an erratic release schedule 5 years running. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This week we have been watching The Defector. It first aired the week of January 1st, 1990. It was written by Ronald D. Moore and directed by Robert Shearer. James, what happens in this one?
A Romulan scout ship crosses the neutral zone, pursued by one of their big green warship things. On board is a defector, with information about an impending Romulan invasion of the neutral zone. Can he be trusted? If so, can war be averted? Or is everyone just a pawn in some cosmic game of chess?
Alex, you've never seen this before. Is everyone just some pawn in a cosmic game of chess?
I think it's possibly early to get onto the metaphysical arguments.
Oh. But what did you think of this episode then?
I thought it was very good. It's the best I think we've probably had in a little while. If you're going by that argument of Series 3's when it gets good, then yeah, this would seem indicative of what you'd expect.
It's quite interesting, I would say, because we've had a run of quite crew-based episodes where they've very much been the primary focus. They've gone through some kind of change, and this week it's completely the focus on a guest star, and obviously the ramifications they have, but you wouldn't say it's an episode that particularly belongs to one of the regular casts. They all get to do something as an ensemble.
I'm glad that we don't have that kind of focus, because that kind of focus has led us into those Troy-based episodes, and then the Riker one, which was essentially just the Troy one again, but with the role reversed. It's good to move away from it. And at this present moment in time, this seems to be what it's doing best, so more of this, frankly.
We have this Shakespearean scene, Henry V, where the king goes among the men, just didn't recognise those guys at all, and to see how his troops are feeling on the eve of war. Setting the tone pretty well in a flippant kind of way. You say it's maybe lazy to say, this is going to be the theme of the episode and we're going to explore it through something that already exists. But you know what? I like that. That is attention to detail that you don't necessarily get. It's cheap, it's easy, but it's good. It's writing. It's proper writing.
It's typical Star Trek.
It would be a lazy argument to make, but it would also be a true one, because the show does it over and over again, that it takes that sort of thing at the start, and then, we'll see how we can hammer home this metaphor by the end of the episode. That said, it was done better than in a lot of other episodes. And it also helped that despite the fact you were watching it at the start and you knew exactly where they were going to be going with this, it was saved by some good performances and a good looking set as well. We've said it before, it always helps when it's dark, and that also applies for Star Trek. But that sort of outdoor set, yeah, it looks good. It made a nice change of pace from everything else that we've had recently.
And what did you think of the Michael Williams actor trying out Shakespeare here? Patrick Stewart, I believe his name is.
He's very hammy. I don't think he'll ever progress very far.
No, perhaps not. I suppose we would say, or what I would say is that there is that eve of war, how will the everyman cope? And possibly that's not really explored very much. There's the scene between Data and Picard where he says, how are the crew feeling? I don't know, I'm an android. I really don't have a clue about that. But I wouldn't say that's the overall theme of the episode as it's sort of set up. It's a bit more general than that. It's almost a little bit more mystery, action orientated.
Yeah, it's definitely not the overall theme in the way that a lot of other episodes are. Essentially it plays into one bit at the end, doesn't it? And aside from that, it crops up a few occasions before then, the thing of should we head into the neutral zone, that sort of thing, but it's only really at the very end that it becomes a major factor again.
What I don't understand is you've got the Romulans entering the neutral zone willy-nilly, and it's not like, oh, we're going to start war. Whereas the Enterprise is just pussyfooting around the issue and just saying, oh, we can't enter the neutral zone because we might start war.
It's like any of us entering Southend. The inhabitants of Southend will stretch out into society, and you know it is a shame, but if any of us were to enter, hell would break loose.
It's quite interesting, almost geographically, to me, that from recent episodes with the enemy, which was a few episodes back, the Enterprise does seem to be located around the neutral zone. It's just hanging around there, almost waiting for incidents to happen. So it would seem it's not really doing much of exploring new life and new civilizations. It's just hanging around waiting for the Romulans to do something interesting.
Well, how often have they actually explored new life and civilizations? They mostly seem to be going on diplomatic missions.
I think maybe they need to change the opening voiceover. So we have this quite exciting setup. We've got a Romulan ship, a really tiny Romulan ship being chased by a really big Romulan ship, and they both look the same, except one is further away.
But models look very nice, I've got to say.
Oh, I just thought, oh, that looks like someone stretched out Starbug a bit.
Yeah. But the thing of it being... the thing of the Romulan ship getting closer and is practically on top of the view screen, that whole shot there, thinking, well, okay, it's stepped up a gear here this week, that's good. And, you know, it sort of sets the tone going forwards. Admittedly, it's a tone that I felt stepped down a bit when the Romulan, I can't remember his name, so I'm not even going to try, is transported aboard the Enterprise and turns around. I mean, the 80s shoulder pads don't help. They just aren't going to help the matter. But when he turns around with these big hunched shoulders in the most monster-looking turn I've ever seen in my life. Sort of meh, as he turns to camera, and I just thought, oh, Jesus Christ almighty. I was relieved, therefore, that it turned out better than that.
Did you think he was going to turn out to be some sort of Romulan monster?
I just sort of pictured this sort of half Uncle Fester, half Lurch character. Just lumbering in, shoulders hunched up to his ears. Talking like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm not a fan of the makeup or the costumes.
And when he transports on board, O'Brien isn't there. He's off duty.
Yeah, I was wondering that through this episode. Where the bloody hell's O'Brien? Not a question I thought I'd be asking myself, but...
Maybe he's playing the cello somewhere.
He can play it, but only outside.
It's a Red Dwarf
reference. It's a Red Dwarf reference.
So we have this character, Jarrock, who the crew don't really have any reason to trust, but he seems to have reason to run, and I suppose it's a question of, is he telling the truth? Is he being deceptive? Is it part of some kind of Romulan ploy? It's an interesting dynamic, and it's a nicely nuanced performance, I think, as well. It's a well drawn out character, a well defined character. He's neither hero nor villain.
I also appreciated, both in terms of the plot and his character, the slow develop, because when he does turn up at first, it just seems like another cut out Romulan, and it does seem like it's going to be another one of those episodes, and you take it or leave it. But then it progresses over the course of the episode. With that side of it, with the character side, we get that scene later with Data, and that's excellent. That's more guest character development than we've had in Christ knows how long, frankly. But also the development of the plot itself, the way that it slowly reveals itself. So, shortly after he transports on board, you have them examining the footage of the ships and plotting the course and working out, well, they're adjusting their speed in tandem. So they were never going to catch up. And you think, oh, okay, that's interesting. So even though we probably are fairly certain the way things are going from the outset of the episode, it just keeps that slight level of uncertainty running, just enough to make you question whether they're going to pull the rug to keep your interest.
Ron Moore, the writer, has said that this is the Cuban Missile Crisis in space, which sounds to me like the most original series setup that it could possibly be, but I don't think it ever feels like an original series episode. It is very much a Next Generation one, even though it's so incredibly Star Trek. It's, questioning your assumptions about a particular character or race and wondering if you can trust them. And then with this kind of metaphor for the world today, it is that proper old-fashioned morality play.
Yeah, I don't get an original series vibe off it. This feels, well, this feels Next Generation. This is debating with words rather than with fisticuffs, trying to work out someone's agenda.
In the original series, Jarok and Picard would have been having a fight to the death by about the 35-minute mark.
Over some woman.
So a shirt would have ripped at some point.
It is interesting when we think about the horrible Troy and Riker love story that we've had up to this point, in the last 2 episodes. We would, had they not had better sense, been inflicted a love story between Crusher and Jarok. But I think they wisely realised that it was too soon for a Wesley love story.
What?
It would have been Dr. Crusher, not Wesley Crusher, but that was the joke.
Right, that would have been awful.
Yeah, it would have been, yes.
It seems like, this episode's agenda is so concise and well written. It seems so strange that it's been massively rewritten to take out one of the major plot points.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be like taking a finely cooked meal and covering it in excrement. Or taking your Radio 2 lineup of hosts and adding Chris Evans in the morning. It's just a bad idea.
It does seem at times like they look at the characters and say, okay, we've got a female guest character this week. Let's pick randomly one of the male main characters who can fall in love with them this week. Oh.
Actually, that has been the plot for several episodes in a run now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Here's the guest cast. Who fancies them this week? Well, Geordie's not been getting much recently.
I think it's very much they have established this universe now. They've got the Romulans. They are clearly, this season, they are building up their presence increasingly. They are kind of the regular enemy at this point, as far as you can tell. It's, you've got a recurring character coming back here in Tomahawk, who we saw quite recently. It seems like there should be bigger plans for him.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll see him loads in the future.
It's learning quite a lot about Romulans in this as well, this sort of sympathetic portrayal, and actually getting to see the planet, I think, for the first time on board the holodeck, which is really exciting.
2 things there. First of all, the sympathetic view of the Romulans, good. I'm always wary when the Next Generation paints a race as bogeymen, and we've seen some quite horrific results of that in the past, and the Romulans had sort of been going that way a little bit. It felt like they didn't have the Klingons anymore, and there's a couple of others that have been and gone, and they didn't have those. So we're going to use the Romulans for that. So I'm all in favour of developing that a bit and showing. I don't want to sound like men's rights activists, by saying not all not all Romulans. It's about ethics in Romulus, which, or incidentally, looks like a horrendous place to live. He goes on for ages talking about how wonderful it is and how he'd miss it. It seems like a desolate hole that's inhabited by no one.
I'm sure if we see Romulus in a future episode, perhaps with Leonard Nimoy, then we might see it as a not very nice place to live.
So much so that you'd be happy to see all of its ruling council poisoned by someone who'd go on to play Bane.
I think with regards to not making villains the big bogeymen, I think Deep Space Nine might be more up your alley, because it actually does make villains the big bogeymen, but it also says, but we're also probably the bogeymen as well.
What about his justification, though? He says he wants to prevent war. I guess we've always seen the Romulans as built up as, well, they're basically the Roman Empire, aren't they? So they are about conquest and invasion, and his justification is he has a child and he doesn't want it to end her life early and the Empire to be at war for all time against the powerful Federation. Do we really buy his justification for his defection? Do you think that comes across as quite enough for this high-ranking admiral to have changed his philosophy so much?
The logic of it, it's thinly drawn, but it's enough to just make it passable.
Yeah, I think the procedural mystery element does help with that, because you're questioning the entire time what the motivations might be, and as the crew investigate, and there's obviously evidence either way of whether he might be telling the truth, and Geordi very much believes in his gut that there's something to this, that he is telling the truth despite having very little interaction with the whole thing. And obviously the facts of the chase seem to indicate that there might be something, and it isn't actually till you get there and you get a slightly more interesting picture, but they play that mystery long enough and in an interesting enough way, and so often it's just it is like a completely different writing team. If you think back to the Vengeance Factor, where they clearly had no idea how to play the mystery at all, and it wasn't even a mystery, and it was just I'm a murderer. Okay, fine, but
there's one person in a locked room and someone's eaten a Savaloy that was left on a table. Who did it?
They have done that. They have done that far more than genuine mysteries.
I realise that was a weird analogy, but I'm very tired.
Well, to be fair, at times it doesn't need to be a mystery. It could be a nice change of pace if it's, we know what's happening, but they don't.
What about the stakes of this episode? It seems all-out war with the Federation. Do you think that's too much? Do you think it's they're too big stakes? Because we never really feel them. I don't feel that the atmosphere is perhaps tense enough. Maybe that's just the lighting in the Next Generation, where everything's so bright and shiny. But I never felt as if they were on the eve of war. Maybe it's a direction. It's an entertaining and interesting episode, but I never felt that sense of doom hanging over everyone.
I think they can't just spring that on you in a 40-minute episode.
It's a difficult balance to play, because in the movies they kind of have to do that and always end up some bad guy threatening Earth, as if in Star Trek we actually care about Earth at any point the rest of the time. And here, you don't really need to raise the stakes, and I suppose that's not what the episode is about, essentially. But, since it is the Romulans and since it is the neutral zone, fine. It doesn't harm the episode, I wouldn't say, but it certainly doesn't really add to it. But you might as well use that element since it's there, and for some reason the Enterprise is more or less the only ship in the fleet along this very strategic, important area.
I can understand why the Enterprise is one of the only ships along the neutral zone, because up until the end of Season 1, it was a matter of we've heard nothing from the Romulans for decades. I wouldn't expect the Federation to suddenly say, well, the Romulans did say that they're back, so we better start putting some ships along the Beta Quadrant.
On the subject of messages from the Federation, the guy Picard keeps talking to by video communicator, the first time doesn't seem anything particularly remarkable, but the second time he speaks to him, that guy is wild-eyed the whole way through that conversation. It's really bizarre. It's just watch it back. He's got wide open eyes, like he's taking the piss out of everything he's saying to Picard. You better take it seriously.
I quite liked the delay though on the secure message. I thought that was quite cool, a bit old school. Very much, you are out here on your own. You must make the decision that decides the fate of the entire galaxy. That very much at sea kind of a metaphor. I quite like that aspect of it. It isolates the Enterprise from this supposedly vast and secure empire that they have, and it is, this ship is, it's determining the entire course of the future, perhaps. Again, you don't really get that weight across in the episode. This might have made a better movie than some of the ones they actually made.
Well, let's be honest, there's two things that Star Trek does well. One is naval parallels, and the second is using text that's out of copyright and basing things around that. And this does both.
Quoting Shakespeare is so Star Trek. It is perhaps the most Star Trek thing available.
Other than Moby Dick.
Keep your Moby Dick to yourself.
But on the subject of things we like, because I think it's probably something that we can all three agree on, the use of the Klingons in this episode is very good. The way that you can just about forget that they were involved earlier, and then they come back at the end. It's very subtly underplayed until it becomes the big thing at the end. The punch the air moment. It's very well done. It's a very satisfying ending.
That works as a setup and payoff. However, there is another, which is Chekhov's little orange pill. Not Star Trek Chekhov, but as in Chekhov's gun. Did they need to show that ahead of time? Oh, I might commit suicide at the end of this episode. I think we could have had him doing that without us seeing that he's got that with him.
At that point in the episode, we may have suspected that it was a pill to kill himself, but it could have been something to sabotage the Enterprise. It didn't necessarily have to be a pill to ingest. It could have just been a little bit of technology or something at that point.
How do you feel about the whole suicide plot point? Because I'm not sure how I feel about that, the way that's played.
I'll make a comparison that we often make, and that's to Red Dwarf, which often has to get rid of characters at the end by killing them in a terrible way. It did seem like the easy option, I think, in terms of storytelling. I think it was a bit... I wouldn't say it was out of place, especially with this man who's lost his family, his reputation, his dignity, everything. I can buy that, but it's a little bit too neat and tidy, wrap in a bow, everything is as it was at the end. So, might it have been more interesting to keep this guy around? Yeah.
I think part of the issue for me, and it would probably be nullified with a second watch, is that because you're questioning everything he's saying beforehand, that you've only really, for the suicide thing, you've only really got that last scene where he's speaking to the other Romulan on the view screen, and he's got that sort of cold acceptance of, so this was all a test all along, which you can sort of see him summing it up and saying, well, that's it then. But obviously it would carry a lot more weight. Well, it does carry a lot more weight with everything that happened with Data before, the realisation that even the the pleasure of being able to have a drink. They can taste it. It's synthetic. The problem is that we've sort of half discounted those scenes earlier. That we can't be sure if it's true or not. So maybe that underplays it a little bit, so that when he's committed suicide at the end, oh, Christ, okay, fine.
Can we talk a little bit about the Romulans themselves? That plot line. They want to basically find out if this guy is a defector, and so they basically ploy him with lots of false information because they think he might be sympathetic towards his planet not going into stupid war. Does it seem a little bit over Machiavellian to anyone? Again, it doesn't matter when you're watching the episode because it works and it makes sense and it's well written and well performed, but does their plan make sense, or is it just a bit much?
Yeah, it is ridiculously over the top. 1984 ends with Winston Smith having a cage of rats put on his face. More believable effort to be put in.
Yeah.
But it does make you think worse of the Romulans. You know, Alex, you were talking before about how it made them not this big, bad, all evil, but you actually, at the end of this episode, are thinking these really are the big evil guys.
It does make me think worse of them, but then so would a cage of rats, so...
It plays into the idea which we've built up of the Romulans being very cunning, and the fact that they're even very cunning with their own people is just insane.
Yes, insane is definitely a word. And I mean, there's that whole thing about he left a letter for his wife and child. Are we going to be able to take it back to them? No. Oh, okay. Fine.
I think they actually do a kind of reversed story like that with Voyager, which is much, much better. An episode called Eye of the Needle. That is a brilliant Voyager twist. But I think overall, Romulans have done quite well in Next Generation overall, but as I said before, Deep Space Nine does them far, far better, particularly in the later seasons.
Well, that was a well-rounded and interesting discussion of science fiction. So let's have some more frivolity in Quickfire.
Quickfire.
According to Ron Moore in an AOL chat in 1997...
This AOL chat is the source of everything, by the way. It's great. I wish I'd been there.
He says, the first draft of the Defector was basically thrown out and we gangbanged the second draft. And then says, yeah, a very un-PC phrase.
I just can't see how gangbanging it would be productive in any way. The only benefit is that you are filling every plot hole. Just doing a little bit of research for Quickfire on the internet, I do take issue with some of the quotable lines, particularly this one. Now if these men do not die well, it will be a black matter for the king who led them to it. Picard. Not really. Kind of, but not really.
The working title of this episode was A Question of Trust, which would go on to be a weekly BBC panel show.
Turning once again to the Nitpicker's Guide for Next Generation Trekkers, under Equipment Oddities, they state that when the Romulan defector arrives at his quarters on the Enterprise, he orders a glass of water from the food dispenser. He specifies 12 something agaians. I am not even going to bother to try and pronounce that. The computer replies that it is calibrated for the Celsius metric system. What happens to the Universal Translator? The Enterprise plays host to hundreds of races. Are the food dispensers so impolite as to demand that everyone conform to a certain measuring system?
But do we even need to explain this? It's ridiculous that they would even bring this up. It's obvious why this is there. It's to make us realise, oh, this man is so far away from home. It's obvious. You don't need to nitpick that. It's bloody obvious.
This episode features 3 new models. There's a new miniature of the Enterprise, 4 foot, which looked lovely, I thought, as well as the Romulan scout ship and the Dederdix class model. Yeah, it's good to have new and original shots for this episode, and I think you can tell people really like making them and do it really well.
Originally, the opening for this episode wasn't going to be based around Henry V. It was going to be another Sherlock Holmes-based scene with Data, but it had to be jettisoned due to rights issues late on, at which point Patrick Stewart suggested the Shakespearean approach, which I think we can all agree worked well.
And isn't that amazing, though? Because it does fit the story, whereas a Sherlock Holmes one would have just been frivolous.
Yeah, no, it's 100 times better, I think, than what we probably would have had otherwise. Even with the slightly hilarious note at the end of Picard just interrupting Data's performance. He's doing really well, and you have to stop him mid-flow and just talk about it and give him notes. Really? Patrick Stewart is performing with Ian McKellen doing Harold Pinter in the West End in London. See how he likes it. You go down there and you start shouting out your notes during his performance.
Well, that wraps up another episode. Thank you so much for joining us. And since you did, why don't you go into iTunes and leave us a review? Even a hostile one will do. We just like the attention. We'll be back next time talking about The Hunted. Another episode which has a sort of similar theme in some ways, but not really. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Idea for a podcast called Mystery Meats, where each week I interview someone in a butcher's and have no idea who it is in advance. Each week on Mystery Meats, you'd have to be quick and get to the point. You'd keep saying, "Now I don't want to rush you, but we will have to be brisket." You're listening to a podcast that's enjoyed with a Savoy at thespoilist.com.